In this post, we're going to be doing a bit of theoretical work. We've mentioned several times the importance of a theoretical framework for character education. And here we're going to talk about a theoretical framework. And in particular, we're going to look at the Neo-Aristotelian framework that has been suggested by the Jubilee Center for Moral Development. Now, this is a very useful framework, and we'll be able to apply it in different contexts as we explore the practices of character education. This is useful, of course, both in the face-to-face and in the online. Whatever sort of approaches practically to character education we want to devise, a theoretical framework is fundamental as we set out on what we do. It's also very important to have a theoretical framework should we teach courses on character education, which I will argue at some point is very important to actually teach courses, to have a taught element that is one of the components to a program of character education. And the theoretical framework is a very important part to have actually thought through what is the theoretical commitments and why do we think this is important and how do we justify it. So here, let's look briefly at this model, and there's others, but here's one particular model that we'll start with, this Neo-Aristotelian model. Basically, what the model says is there's a threefold process that is occurring in virtue development leading to character education. And this is not the caught element, this is the taught element. So this actually has to do with how to teach character education. Three parts in this theoretical framework. The first is a virtue knowledge that is exploring virtue. The second is virtue reasoning that reasons on virtue. And the third is virtue practice. Now let me just go through these three briefly, and then we can discuss them further in the comment box in this blog page. So first of all, the virtue knowledge that explores. In virtue knowledge, what you're actually doing is teaching about the virtues. So there's, in a sense, cognitive transfer. It's propositional. You are giving students a basic grammar, a basic set of definitions of what we're actually talking about. So, for example, in the Bible, there's over 700 specific words for sin. And sin may well be a perfect synonym for vice. Yeah. So words are very important. What do vices look like? What does each virtue look like? Why is it important? So, go through the 7 capital virtues, the 7 capital vices, just talk about them. Give virtue knowledge. What do those, for example, with a particular virtue do particularly well? Or which emotions alert me to the need of a particular virtue? Or which dilemmas and scenarios illuminate issues connected with the virtues? So looking forward into understanding the actual world. So in a sense, here at Virtue Knowledge, I've used the image of a kitten, a curious kitten that's exploring the world and responding to the question, do I know virtue? Do I know what it is and what it looks like? Okay, so that's the first element, knowledge, virtue, in teaching. The second taught component of this framework is virtue reasoning, where you're going beyond knowledge and you're actually exploring what those virtues look like in the real world. So to the knowledge issue that you've addressed in the first component, you're actually adding the world into the equation. So you're coming into the world with your understanding of what virtue is and perceiving what it looks like in the world you actually live in. So in a sense, there's a triangulation happening here between your perception of virtue, what you understand in your mind, the world, and yourself. And these three elements are talking to each other, that what virtue is, what your world is, and who you are, and how those three are working together. Because quite clearly, it's not enough to simply know about virtue. Character is shaped as I continually read myself in the situations through the lens of virtue and character. So I'm reading myself, I'm reading my world through the lens of virtue and character. What are my basic dispositions in light of this virtue? How do I currently act? What might I do to exercise virtue in this particular circumstance? What, for example, is the golden mean, the balance between excess and deficiency of any virtue for me in this situation? So and here I've used the image of an owl. So if the kitten is out exploring virtue knowledge, the owl is looking broad and deep to the world around, trying to understand what virtue looks like in my world. And this, of course, leads straight in, and they're not chronological. You don't do 1, 2, 3. All three of these elements are sort of working together as you teach about character, education, and virtue. The third element is virtue practice. So whereas the knowledge knows, the reasoning understands, the virtue practice actually explores how virtue and character is exhibited in my life. So here, there's the critical component of self-examination, where I actually examine myself. There's reflective practice of the individual in the equation. If you don't do this, you will have just taught theory, you will have taught discernment, but there won't be the actual change in the character, which is the entire sort of final point of the objective of character education. So here it adds me into the equation in a very significant way. So virtue practice is actually asking, okay, how did I respond to the call of virtue in that situation? What might I have done otherwise, and what will I do to be virtuous now in this situation? How do I feel? What are my emotions around this particular situation? How is my self-identity shaped? And how might I strengthen my virtue in a particular area through particular practices, particular habits that I may want to impose on myself? And here the whole issue of constancy is really important. Constancy is actually seen as a container that holds all of the other virtues inside of them. Because of course, as Aristotle has said, one sparrow does not make spring. One good action does not make good character. It's just a good action. So you need to be constant in these good actions of virtue to actually have character. So habituation, having habits, good habits, is really a key in virtue practice that we can teach. So again, it's not just external conformity, it's not just doing, it has to do with your emotions and with your desires. Now, the Jubilee Center, and again, most of this material, you can find it on their website. I'm summarizing it here in this blog post for you. But they've outlined that character education quality comprises a set of 5 components or elements that they've called attention, where you notice situations, emotions, where your feelings are aroused, desire to change things, acts, where you're committed to change, and expression, where you actually communicate to others. There's something that sort of exudes from you as a person of the virtue that you embody. So let me just give you an example of these 5 and then run this video down to a close. Think of the virtue of moderation in terms of alcoholic beverages. So clearly there's understanding of what moderation is, not too much, not too little. As Chesterton famously wrote, that you honor beer and burgundy by moderation. Beautiful little sentence there. So not too much. You understand virtue. You understand, you reason on it in your world, about you, about your world, about moderation. And then in the practice, there's these 5 components that are actually coming together. So there's attention. You notice situations that require moderation. So you may be, in the pub, you may be at a meal, you may be in a social event, and you notice, okay, here's a situation that requires moderation. So there's attention to the situation. There's emotion, where you actually measure how you feel when you lack that moderation. So you think, I've drunk too much. Or someone else has, you go, that person has not been moderate, and you feel something that it is wrong. And whereas on the other hand, you feel well when there is moderation, when you said, no, that's thank you, I've had enough. That's a good feeling because you've acted virtuously in moderation. The third element is desire. You're actually motivated to change things where moderation is not present. So, in yourself, you have a desire to change that as well as in helping others. The acts, the things you're actually committed to do, to not do, X amount of drink every day, X amount of bottles in your personal shelf, X amount of things you will do when you're socially with someone or not. So you're actually acts that you have decided to do or not do. And then expression, what others actually perceive of you when they're around you. Do they perceive moderation in you, although there may be dignified enjoyment, but at the same time moderation, is that perceived by others in you? And these 5 things come together to produce character, to actually show that character in that particular virtue has been embodied in an individual. So that's virtue practice, and that's the aims of what we're aiming at. And again, you can see how much of that can actually be taught, it can be conceptualized, and then it can be turned into programs of actual theological education with your students, where you're actually helping them work through different virtues in this rather articulated way. Here I've used the image of the tigress, so we've gone from the kitten exploring in knowledge to the owl sort of looking and understanding. Here's the tigress who's attentive to the well-being of her cubs. So there's this attentiveness to virtue as a cub. There's a feeling for the needs, a desire to keep them safe, and acting to protect them even at her own peril, and then a sense of safety and of something that exudes from the tiger just in what she is, which is what virtue and character are all about. So this is just a brief overview of a neo-Aristotelian framework for character education. Much more can be said, but these are the 3 components: virtue knowledge, virtue understanding, and virtue practice that can help us put together a framework for character education in theological education.